My name is Jack. I'm the Executive Director at One for the World, and we are an organisation who encourage people to give 1% of their income to the most cost-effective charities working in global health and poverty. We know that, unfortunately, nearly 15,000 children under the age of 5 die every day from completely preventable causes, and they are killed by extreme poverty. So that might be because they don't have enough water to drink, or the water that they have is not clean. It might be that they don't have enough food to eat, or the food that they have to eat is not of good enough quality. Or most commonly, it's because they get diseases which are completely preventable or completely treatable, but they don't have access to the healthcare that they need to not get sick in the first place or to get better. And we are the first generation ever who benefit from the work of people like Toby and his colleagues in academia. We are able to see clearly which organizations are able to have the most profound effect on these problems. And if we were all to give just a small fraction of our income towards those causes, we could eradicate extreme poverty. And I know that Toby today is also going to talk about how there are giving options that we can use to help us deal with existential risk and other causes that are dear to EA as well. So if you're interested in One for the World, please go to our website. Please do check out the ability to take the pledge, and we'd love to have you on board. However, at this point, I'm delighted to introduce Toby Ord. He works at the Future of Humanity Institute. He is a senior academic at Oxford University, and I think he's probably most well known to us as one of the founders of the effective altruism movement, and someone whose thinking and writing has done more to move that movement on than almost anybody else. So Toby, thanks so much for joining us, and welcome to the One for the World webinar series.
Oh, thanks for having me here.
Awesome. My first question, I'm going to launch it at the same time as a poll. So I'm going to launch a poll that's going to ask people whether they've read The Precipice and also how much they currently think about existential risk, just so we have that for context. But I think as a really good starting question, Toby, it'd be great to know, what is The Precipice about?
Sure. I think ultimately it's a book. I've got to answer the poll as well. I think ultimately it's a book about humanity over the very longest timeframes, really zooming out. So it's about the 100 billion people who came before us and the trillions of people who could follow us across the distant future, and how that entire future is at stake at the moment, because this is an extremely special time.
Yeah, and could you expand a bit on why you feel like this is, I think in the book you call it a unique time for humanity?
That's right. So if we look at human history so far, this 100 billion people I mentioned, over 10,000 generations that came before us and built, almost everything we see in the modern world. Like everything I can see now, is ultimately, apart from my own body, was created by this huge project of these 100 billion people cooperating over deep time. And they, in doing so, they've the story of human progress has been this story of increasing power over the world, with rapid accelerations in the agricultural revolution, when we started to have permanent settlements and cities, and then again in the Industrial Revolution with machines. And this increasing power finally kind of came to a head in the 20th century with the development of nuclear weapons, because that was the first time where we became powerful enough to destroy ourselves. But in contrast to our power, our wisdom has grown only falteringly, if at all. And so we have the power to destroy ourselves without the wisdom to ensure that we don't. And that has put us in a situation where if the risks are anything near as high as I think they are, that it's a really unsustainable level of risk. We can't go on increasing risk as we have been, in the 75 years since the development of nuclear weapons and onward, without ultimately coming to an end in a small number of centuries. So I think that one way or the other, this period, this precipice of heightened risk is going to come to an end. Either we destroy ourselves, or we rise to these challenges and we put in place the principles and institutions needed to ensure that that risk gets low and stays low.
Fantastic. I'm just going to share the result of our poll, just so that everybody's aware. First of all, around 1 in 3 people has actually read The Precipice. I have to say, having just read it, I would really, really, really recommend that you read this book. I think it'll change your mind about stuff, which it definitely did for me. But also, this is not always the most easy topic to engage with. And Toby, I think you write really clearly about this and lay it out in a way that people who are not specialists will be able to follow. So I really would recommend it. In terms of how often people think about existential risk, you can tell I wrote these questions before reading the book, because I now know that an asteroid impact is a relatively minor risk in terms of existential risk. But 12% of people basically might think about it just before the asteroid actually hits us, like the comic book guy in The Simpsons. Around 2/3 of people think about it semi-regularly. A small number, a handful of people, it's their full-time job. Some people are staying up at night, and a very small number of people wonder how we can all be so calm when we're all about to be obliterated, and wonder why no one's listening to them. Toby, just picking up on what you said about the difference between humanity's capacity and wisdom, you use a really useful analogy in the book, I think, which is you describe humanity as like an adolescent. So could you explain the kind of points of similarity between adolescence and the position we're in terms of human progress?
Yeah. So humanity is about 200,000 years old, Homo sapiens, and a typical species lifetime is about 1 million years. So this is a huge span of time. About 800,000 years ahead of us would be typical. It could easily be much shorter or much longer, but it's useful to have some guideline of how long it often lasts. And that would put us, if you think of that in terms of a normal 80-year human life, that would, put us in our adolescence. And I think that this is actually quite fitting because an adolescent, say, a 16-year-old, is just powerful enough to be able to actually get into situations where they risk their entire future, but not yet wise enough to ensure that they don't. And if you scale things down, then say the next election cycle, which is often about the time span that that governments can think in terms of let's say the American one of 4 years, is just the equivalent of 4 hours in this lifespan. We have so much more ahead of us that to risk our entire future for the sake of the next 4 hours or the next 8 hours or even the next day, if someone's thinking what we'd normally call long term, thinking about 25 years, then this is still just an incredibly small amount of time. And this style of argument is common in some other areas. So, for example, I think it's a key aspect of an environmentalist type of argument that it's because if we risk the irrevocable destruction of various parts of our environment, either an ecosystem or a particular species, that would be gone forever for the sake of our transient aims, that you again get this ratio between how long the future might be and how short this moment where we're getting these gains is. Or similarly, even in conservative political thought, so lowercase c conservatism, it's a similar idea that maybe we should improve things, but to put something really important about what we've got going at risk for the sake of small acceleration, perhaps we could go more slowly and not put this at risk. So I think it's a structure of argument that you do see in other places and is actually capable of moving people a great deal and shaping how they take their moral or political actions, but is very rarely applied to this grandest scale. And the two analogies I mentioned, the one about our power and our wisdom, and also the one about us being like an adolescent, Carl Sagan made both of these points. And in fact, his 1983 paper, where he looks at nuclear winter, came up with many of the key insights behind existential risk. One of the things I try to contribute in the book is to flesh out this history of this idea a bit more, and to link it into the history of the anti-nuclear movement, which I think were the kind of forebears of this. Sometimes it's treated as if it's this nerdy contrarian idea that kind of came out of nowhere. and that seems like, how would anyone actually believe this or act on this? But actually, I do think it's continuous with both the anti-nuclear movement and also the climate movement, both of which have been the preeminent movements, social movements of their time. Raising the largest crowds ever and really mobilizing a lot of people. But part of the problem is that while those are two existential risks, heightening the analogy even more, they're just particular risks. And in both cases, it took about 4 decades to go from the understanding that this really is an existential risk, or that it could be at least, through to the point where we had these large social movements. And that's just too long a delay if we have to keep building a new movement around every new technology or every new type of risk. So I think that it's really important that we take on this idea of existential risk in general and about protecting humanity's potential, and that we that's what's really at stake, is the entire future of humanity. And it actually doesn't matter that much exactly which risk threatens it. The kind of conclusion should be the same. There's some similar analogies to global poverty and global health, that those of us in the effective altruism movement are not so bothered about whether someone is at threat of AIDS or cancer or diarrheal illness. What we care about is that they're at risk and that we could help them.
Yeah, so for those of you on here who are students, and I think many of you are, think seriously about whether you can dedicate some time towards building a movement around averting existential risk, because as we're going to talk about later with Toby, this is a seriously neglected area by almost any reasonable measurement in terms of the amount of risk there is and the amount of resources we're putting into it. Toby, there were a few things I wanted to pick out in what you just said, and one of them is, there is a sort of tension, I think, in the Precipice, a good one, to the breadth of time that we're talking about. So you finish the book by talking about what humanity might achieve if it's able to last, I think it's 10 billion years into the future or 60 billion years. The tension of the sort of that cosmic timescale and the sense of urgency that you think there needs to be to act right now. And I was thinking about this because I'm a US politics obsessive in the context of a small kind of trivial parochial election that's going to be happening next week, and possibly for the 6 weeks after that while they sort out who won. When you look at things like elections, how consequential do you feel that they are? So without necessarily focusing on one candidate, we have actually seen in, for example, Donald Trump and Dominic Cummings in the UK and the US, people who have a lot of influence, have very different approaches to existential risk. How profound do you see the consequences of those? Or do you tend to zoom out to a kind of cosmic perspective and think, politicians come and go?
I think that there can be important consequences from things that happen now. I mean, this is really one of the key aspects of the book, that where the kind of moral power of this idea is coming from is this huge future that's at stake. As I lay out in the final chapter, it's both a matter of the future being so much longer than the present, but also of the other ways in which the future could be substantially bigger or better. But if we, so that's where the power is coming from. But then to some extent, it could be that the people of the future are perfectly well placed to sort out their own problems, such that most of the value that humanity ultimately achieves will happen in the future. But why do we have any special leverage over it? And that's where this argument about existential risk comes in, that if all of these future generations are kind of cancelled, if they can never exist, then we can see why it would be that's a situation which they can't do anything about. Even if they're more rich and powerful than us, they would never get any chance to do anything about it if they're wiped out earlier. So that's the kind of explanation as to how you can get this kind of position of leverage, and any irrevocable issue could cause this, and particularly existential risk, which is basically by definition it's the largest scale irrevocable issues. The irrevocable loss of almost all value, either through extinction or some permanent, inescapable collapse of civilization or similar. So when it comes to this particular election, there are direct connections to existential risk. For example, Donald Trump has said that he doesn't want to re-sign the New START treaty. This is a wildly successful treaty between the US and the USSR, well, former USSR, now Russia, reducing the amount of nuclear weapons. He's let another treaty lapse, the INF treaty. And if he lets this one lapse, then I think for the first time in about 40 years, there will be no limit to the amount of nuclear weapons that either nation can possess. And this is due to expire, I think it's about a month after the inauguration. So that's just an example of where there's kind of very direct connections. Sometimes it does get exaggerated, though. For example, in the posturing with North Korea, if there were a nuclear war with North Korea, that would be extremely bad. Absolutely terrible catastrophe for the nations involved. But it wouldn't be a global catastrophe, and probably wouldn't involve any kind of nuclear winter. And often people lose sight of that. They think nuclear war, that's as bad as it can get. But a nuclear war between Russia and the US would have 1,000 times as many warheads or something, and would have a much greater effect. And so people lose track of that when pundits write on these things.
Yes, and I think it's worth saying at that point to issue a bit of a disclaimer on Toby's behalf. When we're dealing with existential risk, we are talking about something that kills 100% of humanity, or as you explain in the book, locks us into a future that's dystopian and prevents us ever realizing our potential as a species. That is not to say that the consequences of non-existential events can't be absolutely awful. And in fact, we're going to talk about coronavirus later in this webinar, which anyone would recognize is a horrendous thing that has caused enormous suffering. But when we're being strictly philosophical about this, when we're talking about existential risk, we have to treat differently things that are absolutely terrible and things that would actually wipe out the whole of humanity.
That's right. A phrase I use in the book is whether something is perhaps even a dark age for humanity, or whether it's ultimately the end of the story. There have been dark ages in the past, and is extremely bad, but it doesn't have this particular special form of badness. And so people it's very tricky to talk about these things because this is partly an issue that comes up with ineffective altruism generally, is that it's not very pleasant to compare different things that are very important to people and that they're spending their life, dedicated to. So it's not meant to be belittling, the suffering in any kind of lesser catastrophe. But I do try to be very clear to avoid exaggerating the scope of existential risk, to be saying that lots and lots of things are existential risks, and thus they're important, and thus everyone should work on them, and huzzah. Instead, I do want to be careful to say, actually, it is more limited in scope, but the things that it applies to will be extremely bad, and a lot of effort should be applied.
Great. We have our first questions coming in from the audience. Please keep them coming in, folks. I genuinely have thousands of questions that I'd like to ask Toby, but I'd prefer him to answer yours. And I think we can address a couple of them at the same time. And the link between them, I think, is in the book, you lay out 3 different types of existential risk. So perhaps you could talk about what those types of existential risk are, because that connects to 2 questions. One is anonymous and says, what's the most likely X risk this century and what probability do you assign to it? Strap in, folks, because that's not a reassuring answer. And the other one is from Joel, who I think is probably picking me up on conflating the word risk and the word probability. But he's sort of making an argument for why impact from an asteroid or a comet might be something that we should devote more time to. So maybe if you could start with those 3 types of risk, and then we'll zoom in on these 2 questions.
Yeah, sure. So I divide things up in the book in terms of natural risks, or naturally arising, and then 2 different kinds of anthropogenic risk. Partly because otherwise the chapter on anthropogenic risk would be vastly too long. where I divided up into the kind of the current anthropogenic risks and then the risks on the horizon. So in terms of natural risks, these include things like asteroid or comet impacts or supervolcanic eruptions. And asteroid impacts are extremely well studied now. We only actually found out about them extremely recently. It was only in 1965 that we were first confirmed that asteroids, or that asteroid craters were caused by objects from space. And only in 1980 that we definitively showed that a mass extinction, or not even definitive, but we first really suggested that a mass extinction was caused by an asteroid. And then that very quickly set in motion a lot of space science. And now they've tracked, huge numbers of asteroids. And in fact, they've tracked so many of them that we know that they've seen whether they're on a trajectory to hit us in the next 100 years. And basically they've tracked more than 90% of them, and so this reduces the risk compared to a typical century by a factor of 10 or more. And ultimately, I think the existential risk from asteroids in the next 100 years is about 1 in a million. So it's what's nice about the example is that it's a fairly well understood risk. It involves a lot less handwork than some of the others. And also it's a fairly well managed one. The relevant community is doing a great job. But when it comes to anthropogenic risks, it's much harder to know the probabilities. So I should say as well, for all natural risks put together, there's a very nice argument from the fossil record that we've survived so far for 2,000 centuries without succumbing to any of them. And so long as they haven't been increasing over that time, then we can argue that ultimately the risk per century has to be lower than about 1 in 1,000. Otherwise, we wouldn't have survived so long. And if you make this precise and you look at some extra details and extra versions of this argument, I think it comes to about a 1 in 10,000 risk per century, or 1 in a million per year from natural risks. Whereas with anthropogenic risks, there's only been 75 years that we've faced these risks. And so you can't run a similar argument. It may be that we just got lucky last century and that the risk is actually quite high. But ultimately, I would put it at about a 1 in 1,000 risk per century from nuclear war and from climate change, and also all other environmental damages put together. But when it comes to risks on the horizon, I think that the two that I'm most concerned about are from engineered pandemics, from advances in biotechnology, which I would put at about 1 in 30. And then also from unaligned artificial intelligence, which I'd put at about 1 in 10. And that's the highest risk that I look at. And all told, my set of estimates, which are very rough and subjective, would put the existential risk over the next 100 years in total at about 1 in 6.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the headline takeaway from the book. That was pretty striking to me, and especially when I realized that was what you thought it was after certain mitigating actions were taken. So you actually think it might be 2 in 6 if we don't start behaving a bit more responsibly. I think at this point it would be worth just talking a little bit about how you treat these probabilities, because you talk in the book about Bayesian probability, which people may or may not be familiar with. But one thing that we do know is that people in general are really bad at dealing with things that have a small risk of occurring and are very severe, or even weighing the probability of different events, or even sometimes understanding how common or not a particular percentage might be. So the one that I always think of is people are greatly more concerned about flying from a safety point of view, even though driving is just obviously from a probability point of view, you're much more likely to have a serious accident while you're driving than you're flying. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you use these probabilities. Yeah,
so in science, a lot of people don't put probabilities on things, or they don't put numerical probabilities unless they can run a very long sequence of things, and that they can say that the probability is the limiting frequency. If we were to run the experiment 1 million times, what fraction of those 1 million times does the event happen? But as Carl Sagan said, events that might cause the end of humanity can't be tested like that, or at least not more than once. So, Jonathan Schall, also talked about this. We don't have any kind of spare Earths that we can destroy in a laboratory in order to check these things. And so, when it comes to science, what we like to do, is to test it enough times. For example, in order to be able to say there's a 1 in 6 chance to really, in Schall's terms, have destroyed something like 100 or 1,000 Earths in order to actually be able to kind of hone in on that number and say it with some kind of certainty. But obviously we can't do that. And this is one of the real challenges of existential risk. That doesn't mean that it's 0 or that it's 1. It doesn't mean that you can ignore it. And it also doesn't mean that it's meaningless to put numbers on this. And this is the kind of idea behind Bayesianism. Or more generally, you could, I guess, not many people do, but you could think in terms of degrees of belief or credences, but have slightly different approaches to all of the details that Bayesians have. But not many people do, because the Bayesians, I think, have pretty good answers. And so, in particular, I thought it would be a disservice to the reader if I didn't include numbers here. If I just said there is a very grave risk, say, of nuclear war destroying the world, and a large risk or something of AI, you'd have really no idea what I was talking about with that. The very grave risk, given how serious the stakes are, could be anywhere from 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 10 or something. And so ultimately, while these numbers have a lot of uncertainty, I treat them all as order of magnitude estimates, so to within the right factor of 10. But basically, you might, if I just used words to refer to them, then your interpretation of what I'm talking about could get off by a factor of 10 just from the words, even before you take into account the error in like my judgment about it. So it would kind of compound or double the amounts of error in all of these things. So I felt that I really would be doing a disservice if I didn't actually tell you what I thought. And when I try to estimate these things, I'm trying to work out, what degree of belief I have that ultimately that we'll make it through this time period, or that we'll fail because of this particular risk. And that takes into account, or at least I'm trying to take into account, all of the mitigation that we'll actually do on it. It's very difficult to do that because partly I'm hoping that once we see how large the risks are, we'll act on them. And I'm trying to take that into account as well. But as Jack said earlier, perhaps the headline number should actually be 2 in 6, which is my best estimate for kind of business as usual, the risk that we'd suffer an existential catastrophe if we don't get our act together and just carry on as we are, or something very close to 0, which is the risk, I think, if humanity really did get its act together on this. I think we really could, in the next century, get the risk down low and actually put in place the structures needed to keep it low forever. So I think that this isn't some kind of immutable aspect that we can't really do anything about. I think that it's very much up to us. And that's partly because the main risks are anthropogenic, not natural. And these anthropogenic risks, while they cause a lot of problems and there are a lot of challenges for how in an international world we can kind of work together to deal with them, they are at this level within humanity's control. If a whole lot of humans got their act together, maybe if they tried to get their act together in, say, 1700, they still could have done nothing much about asteroids. But if we all kind of got our act together, we could do a lot about nuclear weapons because we could just get rid of them. There's obviously a lot that goes on behind that, but I still think that it's a useful thing to note.
Great. So as you just laid out, the range of possible outcomes is pretty broad, from a 2 in 6 chance that we don't make it to a almost 0% chance that we don't fulfill our potential. And we have lots of questions about practical actions that we can take. So I'm going to link a few of those together. The main risk that you identify, the one that you think is the biggest risk, is unaligned AI. And so we have a question from Jamie: which AI risk scenarios are you most concerned about? We have an excellent one, just let me find it, that asks from Jeffrey Hook, saying, how are we going to stop AI turning us all into paper clips, which I think is a reference to a common demonstration of how AI might inadvertently wipe us all out. And we also have some questions about practical things we can do about AI. So perhaps you can talk about that.
Yeah. So this is something that that indeed concerns me a lot, and I devote a lot of my time to trying to work on AI risk. Although I should say as well that while I think it's a very large risk, and I think that's a common view in the effective altruism community, it does have quite a number of people who are specializing in it now, which is great to see. Whereas the number of people who are trying to look at existential risk on the whole and try to work out a whole lot of ways of conceptualizing and dealing with it in general is very few. There's only really a couple of people doing this. So just want to lay that out there. But I think that the easiest way to look at the risk, and that's the least speculative or crazy sounding, is to decompose it into two questions. The first one is, what's the chance that we develop greater than human AI in the next 100 years? And I've thought about this a lot, and I've in fact done technical work on metrics for intelligence for general intelligence systems and things like this. And I've talked lots with DeepMind and OpenAI about these things. And my personal view is that something like 50-50 chance over the next 100 years. And then if you say, well, you might think that, but what does the community of specialists think? There's been a big survey, and ultimately the answer is about the same. There's a lot of disagreement, but the median AI researcher who publishes at the top conferences thinks also about a 50% chance that we develop systems that can do all of the types of jobs that humans can do, from writing poetry through to whatever, that it's about 50% over the next century. And in fact, the general public think a kind of similar thing as well. So it's difficult to say, well, you would think that, wouldn't you? What about these other groups? It is actually pretty much the average of what every group thinks. It's not actually, within every group, there's a lot of disagreement, but it's not it's not far from the typical view. And then you could ask, okay, well, what happens then? And ultimately, I think humanity, if we look at our history and we ask, how is it that we have this soaring potential and that we're in control, more or less, of our destiny? Certainly no one else is in control of it. There's a small amount that's up to chance still from natural events that we can't deal with, but only a small amount, and we're increasingly able to deal with it. If there's only a 1 in 10,000 chance we succumb to natural risk this century, well, we can probably last a few centuries until we can deal with them. So it's mainly the risk is from us. How did we get to this position? It's not because we're stronger or fitter than other species. It's because we're more intellectually capable. It's our cognitive abilities, our abilities to work together and ultimately accumulate culture and technology. And if we developed these AI systems, then they would be better than us at pretty much precisely the skill that enabled us to secure this position. So what we'd be doing is 50% chance of building entities that would ultimately outcompete us at what gave us the power to control our destiny. Now, that doesn't mean that we would lose control of our future, but it certainly puts it onto the table as a very plausible thing that would happen. You might ask then, why would we retain control? And I think partly because we would choose to try to do so. But unfortunately, if you ask the experts on this, the people who are doing the work of trying to work out how to control advanced AI systems that are more intelligent than the user, they're the ones who are leading the concern. And they're actually quite pessimistic about this. It's extremely difficult to work out how to control these systems, to make it so that they want to build the ideal future for us, or that they want to give us the freedoms to do that and to not interfere with our potential. It's very hard to specify or describe these things. So ultimately, if you think about a 50% chance that we have such systems in the next 100 years, and then say about a 20% chance that ultimately in that transition, our potential is squandered because we lose control of this long and potentially glorious future. Then the 50% times the 20% gives you a 10%. And that's where my 1 in 10, it's a rough, or it's more of a sanity check on my 1 in 10, and a good way to try to think about it. And more recently, there was obviously work by Eliezer Yudkowsky and Nick Bostrom, and Nick Bostrom's great book, Superintelligence. And my thinking is actually pretty much on similar lines to in Superintelligence. I'm worried about particularly agent-like systems having goals that it's very hard to specify a goal that doesn't lead to them trying to take control from us and lead to either human extinction or a very terrible outcome for people, because of the fact that we would get in the way of them achieving most kind of insatiable goals that they could have. And it's very difficult to describe goals that aren't insatiable. So these are some technical aspects. But there has been more work recently in the AI safety community looking at a whole lot of other reasons why AI might be dangerous. And I think that some of them have some merit, but I actually think that these original style of arguments are still the most powerful.
Yes, and just on that point about goals, if you were wondering why one of the questions referenced paper clips, that is the example I was talking about, which is if you created an artificial intelligence where the sole goal of the AI was to produce more paper clips, you could see it ultimately liquidizing humanity in the service of more paper clips. So this is a very important area of research. I want to talk very quickly about pandemics because they've been a little bit on people's mind. And I don't know if you and your publisher conspired to launch the coronavirus because I understood that it was Bill Gates. But nonetheless, this is a really interesting time to have a book out about existential risk because I think it's been more on people's minds than we had thought before. So first of all, can you talk about how much risk you think there is from a pandemic actually becoming an existential risk?
Yeah. As with all these things, it's quite hard to work out. One thing that's important to note is that this natural risk argument from the fossil record, which tries to say that because humanity's been around for 2,000 centuries, we know the risk must be quite low, that this probably doesn't work when it comes to pandemics, because although they are naturally arising risks, they, at least, if we're thinking about natural pandemics, not engineered pandemics, it's not clear that the risk has stayed constant or gone down over time. There is some plausible chance that it's gone up. In particular, the risk from pandemics being so big that they destroy all of humanity. For example, for the last 70,000 years, for at least about 60,000 years, humanity has been separated out into different world zones that aren't in contact with each other. So I'm thinking in this case about Australia and Afro-Eurasia, and then about 10,000 years ago, the Americas were settled. And then we had these non-interacting regions, so it'd be very hard for a pandemic to destroy everyone. And so it's not clear that the same argument doesn't quite easily apply. That said, none of these world regions was wiped out by a pandemic. So, one can get into more details. But if we look at, there's a lot of things that have made health better and medicine better at fighting pandemics. But there's also things that have made it worse, clearly, including the fact that the whole of humanity is connected, and also that we're connected so swiftly with air travel. In particular. That said, I would ultimately say something for natural pandemics, something like a risk of 1 in 10,000 per century. So about the same scale of all natural risks put together, but smaller than the anthropogenic risks. And that's partly because it is actually very difficult to get a disease that would wipe us all out. And they're not normally selected for doing that. Usually a disease that wipes out all of its hosts doesn't actually propagate very well. So you tend not to get them, but it's not impossible. It has happened.
Yeah, so I think I was thinking a lot about coronavirus and what potential lessons we can learn from it about existential risk. And I can't decide whether it makes me optimistic or pessimistic about pandemics and actually about X risk in general. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is, on the one hand, emphasizing again how awful COVID is and how we've all been affected by it. And so there may be people on this call who have actually lost relatives to it. That is obviously horrendous. But whilst recognizing that, it has probably shown us how difficult it is for a pandemic, certainly a naturally occurring one, to have the necessary ingredients to be truly existential in risk. You know, the death rate from COVID, I think I'm right in saying, is below sort of 2% across all cases, which is not nearly the level it would need to be to cause an existential risk. And I also wonder whether coronavirus might create some of the political focus needed to take these sorts of risks more seriously, because it's become abundantly obvious that we have neglected even non-existential risks in terms of national stockpiles and contingency plans and so on and so forth. But the reason that it makes me pessimistic is you talk about types of international cooperation and the role of multilateral organizations and all the things that we could do to try and get a handle on existential risk. And we seem to have just had an absolute litany of case studies of that not happening. I mean, the global response to coronavirus has not shown openness, the commitment of resources needed to take it on effectively. It hasn't shown the level of cooperation with governments grounding flights that were due to deliver PPE to other countries. And so I wonder whether you are more optimistic, less optimistic, or just the same as you were before coronavirus occurred?
Yeah, probably more pessimistic overall. I think that there's a couple of things going on here. One is the causal thing. So given that this happened, did it increase or decrease risk? It may have decreased risk because of it serving as a warning shot, as you mentioned. But even though it's terrible in many ways, almost always. This is a kind of a silver lining. But it may have provided some kind of wake-up call. I'm not sure that we'll heed it though, but at least there's some chance that we will. And certainly the UK government, at the moment is I'm involved in various discussions to try to get extreme risk onto the agenda, and there's a lot of interest from the government in that. But if we also, gained this information, right? The stuff that wasn't causal, but was informative. And you're right that it showed us that at the international level, in terms of international cooperation and international institutions, the story's not great. In fact, it may have caused damage to the World Health Organization by having nations, attack it so vociferously. And then also, I'd add to what you said that within individual nations also, the story has been pretty depressing. There have been some success stories, but here in the UK, it seems to not be going very well, and going worse than I would have thought. I would have thought that various kind of some kind of like push towards rationality and some kind of push towards, the interests of the politicians to not have a large part of the electorate killed by disasters under their watch and so on, that this would align. And, that the best way to do that is to listen to the experts on what needs to be done. But that doesn't seem to be happening. So that's some reasons for concern.
Yes, it is notable that in the films that deal with an asteroid heading towards Earth, no one ever has a politician claiming that the asteroid is merely a hoax invented for political reasons. This has only just occurred to me, but it's clearly a very realistic part of what will actually happen, missing from these films. To give us a more positive slant on this, an excellent question that's been upvoted more than any others from an anonymous attendee. What does the ideal situation look like in a world where we are adequately working on these existential risks? What policies and actions should be in place?
That's a good question. And I should open by disclaiming that we don't know much about this. That the key purposes of the Precipice are to create to better understand the situation of existential risk and the moral case for doing something about it, and what are the risks that we're currently facing, and to do that in a way that is open to the general public, to try to broaden this idea out, and also to do it in a way that's much more humanistic than's been done before. I think a lot of the stuff within effective altruism, at least, has presented it as a very contrarian or counterintuitive topic, and I try to come into it in a way that's actually just very obvious, in the same way that climate change and nuclear war were clearly very bad things that could raise large movements to fight them. I think that the wider class of existential risks are too. But where was it? What was the aspect? Oh, the institutions, yeah, or
the policies and actions.
So that's kind of where I was kind of largely coming from. But I did want to say a bit about what we can do about these things, and I think that ultimately a lot needs to happen at the international level, because a lot of these risks involve everyone coordinating. For example, if we, I think that the optimal thing we could do about AI risk is to go more slowly and carefully with AI development. But this is kind of very difficult if different countries, all want to race ahead, and are not that excited about unilaterally slowing down while all of their competitors race ahead. So that's a situation where, is just one of many situations where international things are useful. It may also turn out that advanced AI systems, like, say, nuclear power, are the type of thing that should be controlled at some kind of government level, because it would be too risky to just allow any individual to have access to it. But that might not happen if there's a whole lot of different nations all coming to their own conclusions about this. I mean, it might not be the right way either, but it's just useful to think there could be a lot of cases like this where if one nation happens to go the wrong way, then we're all in trouble. So there's some reasons there. But and another is that each country only has a small fraction of the world's population, and so they tend to underweight how bad this would be, because a lot of the damage would be borne by others in other countries, and then also in other generations. So I think that international institutions are going to be very important. I think on a kind of small level, one could imagine, like a kind of gradual level, you could imagine an institution in the UN like the IPCC to pull together consensus views from scientists about existential risks, that's kind of like tasked with just collating and compiling and presenting the expert consensus. You could also imagine, groups with larger portfolios than that. For example, kind of potentially some name and shame abilities to say which countries are doing well, which countries aren't on this. And I think that threatening to destroy humanity, for example, building if America or the Soviet Union had built a doomsday device, something set to go off and either destroy everyone with nuclear weapons or destroy people with biological weapons, such a threat and such a thing that could be built wouldn't actually have been in violation of international law. But intuitively, this would be a crime against humanity. As it happens, if it went off and killed everyone, it would be against the law, but no one could ever enforce that. And if it didn't go off, it wouldn't be against the law. So either way, the law doesn't do anything at the moment. But it seems to me that threatening existential risk should be a crime against humanity, if anything is. So that's an example of something that people who are interested in international law could try to push for. And I should say now, well, at least in a few months' time, I think nuclear weapons will be against the law. There's been a big push on that, which is quite exciting, although not as impactful as you might think, because none of the nuclear weapons using states are signatories of it, and they're all planning to ignore it. But it might help coalesce action in the future around eliminating nuclear weapons. So there are a few kind of like small ideas, but going much broader, I think ultimately it's essential for the long-term survival of humanity that we make a lasting commitment to get this existential risk down and keep it down. It can't even go down as low as 1% per century, because that's too high. That means that you last about 100 more centuries. Instead of lasting for the 8,000 more centuries of a typical species. You lose almost all of your future if you just get it down to 1%. It needs to be lower than that, and to be on a schedule that keeps getting lower and lower. And that's a kind of a serious commitment that we'd have to make, and we'd have to be able to kind of like bind future generations into as well. And so I talk about that a little bit as a constitution for humanity, that our generation or generations of this moment, the precipice, on finally waking up to these risks, if we could get as much kind of action and momentum around that as there is around, say, climate or environmentalism, then we might be able to put into place some kind of constitution for humanity, binding us over the future to get these risks down and keep them down. There's very general terms, but I think that's all we can say at the moment.
Yes, and there are some sources of optimism. You note in the book examples of groups of scientists agreeing to limit areas that they would do research or access to it because they feared that there would be dangerous consequences if they didn't. And there are obviously examples of sweeping multilateral cooperation between countries that have had very successful outcomes. So it's not all doom and gloom. A lot of questions in here. There are almost certainly lots of students watching this, and there are lots of questions, including Devon's one at the top, about areas that are currently neglected when it comes to mitigating existential risk. Where would you like to see people who are watching this direct their time or their money if they're interested in this cause area?
Yeah, I think a lot of it depends upon, so that there's how high are the risks in different areas. Is a key aspect about, we often think in terms of this neglectedness, importance, and tractability, and how like many percentage points of existential risk there are is like the importance, and some risks vary by, I think, up, a factor of 1,000 or more in how high that risk is, which is a big aspect. But there's also this question about how neglected they are. So something like climate change is a lot less neglected than other areas, such as biosecurity or AI risk. So I think that can be a key factor. But then another really key one that could easily be another factor of 10 in terms of how important it is to work on something directly is how well you're fitted to it. So I think that that's a key as well. So I'd say that philosophically minded people may well want to work on existential risk in general, the kind of thing that my book's trying to do. And people who are technically minded, AI safety could be very good. And people who are in kind of biosciences, I think that working on biorisk is extremely important. I think people who are kind of policy minded, having people who care about this stuff in the world of policymakers and politicians is extremely important as well. And international law, I already mentioned, is another kind of aspect.
Great, and I do, so there's some really good examples of places you can put your time. I do just want to circle back. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, which is a shame because there are some fantastic questions left in the Q&A. But you are one of the founding members of Giving What We Can. In fact, I think it was your brainchild. And you estimate that you've given away 25% of everything that you've earned. How important is donating still in your view of living a good life and doing the most good possible? And there are some technical questions in the chat about how and where people can donate specifically to try and help with mitigating existential risk.
Yeah, okay. So I think donating is really important. I'm still giving a fair fraction of my income. And hopefully that 25% will go up over the rest of my life as well. And that's all to global poverty related charities. And then I signed away the advance and royalties of this book to charities that are working on existential risk. Perhaps I can give Jack a list of such groups and he can send it out for particulars. It's also on the Precipice has a website, theprecipice.com, which also, I think in the resources section, has a list of, in fact, the charities that the royalties are split between. And what I've tried to do there is go for fairly blue chip type charities on existential risk. Often you hear about kind of something that a couple of people in a basement are doing, but I also want to give some kind of examples that actually just are very intuitively solid, such as the Nuclear Threat Initiative, working on nuclear weapons and doing a lot of good work over the years.
Great, thank you. Guys, I'm afraid we're going to have to draw it to a close then because I'm respectful of Toby's time. Toby, that was great. Thank you. I had said in the chat, I've never felt such optimism and fear at the same time. I can actually empathize with that. I don't often on these webinars really encourage people to to read any particular book or look at any resource, but I would really recommend that you read The Precipice. It has profoundly changed my view on these things just in the last week, and I think it's explained to me lots of things that I simply did not know about before. So I really would recommend that. But in the meantime, thanks very much for coming, and Toby, so much for being with us. We really value your time and input.
Oh, thank you. It's been great to be here and to get to talk to this wonderful community of people who are really taking giving seriously. It's exciting to see how far these ideas have spread and how far they've come.